Hello everyone, today we talk about Poland-Lithuania during the 15th century. It's not the first time that I address, a realm as a whole, except in this case it's basically two plus the various lands collected, right? The various crowns, actually, including Bohemia and Hungary, collected by the Jagiellonian dynasty. It is, in fact, however, the first video on this sort of duo. We will, however, get for especially Western Europe to that too as well. For example, never made a very short introduction episode for the entire Kingdom of England or the entire Kingdom of France, etc. But we'll get there too, because it's a sort of more comprehensive thing. We'll probably also go by centuries at some point for that. So it's plenty of sort of cross overlapping info that, however, we can always tell in a different way from a different perspective. I made a video about Europa Jagiellonica last winter, if I'm not wrong, which talks mostly about the reign of Casimir, and we will see also today Casimir IV, and we have already given an idea of more or less the boundaries, the historical, political context, but we haven't gone much in depth, so we will gradually achieve that too. One of the most important things is, of course, to recognize the role of essentially the Polish-Lithuanian Union that, as you know, came to be, say, we will also talk Commonwealth after 1569, but it was, say, a sort of complex development. It didn't simply happen overnight. Initially, the Lithuanians were toying with essentially making the same royal or princely, in that case, marriage with the Muscovy. All right, and instead they chose Poland. So just think how much history changed just because of that, and it's difficult to look at today's map of Europe and say, what the hell was really, Poland-Lithuania, right? It's not even just, okay, well, draw a perimeter of the land that it was, and aside from saying, my God, that's freaking huge, it's mostly the cultural background that I think has been forgotten, not lost, because of course there is, and I miss those videos in which I made a bit more of political content as far as also the sense of a European identity and sort of the, not just the imperial ideology, but say what it means to be truly a Westerner in many ways, in a broader sense. So I think that discussing this polity is always particularly important, right? I was thinking of making, maybe just the 15th century Kingdom of Poland as such. Well, I could make that, but it's better at this point, given that the Union had been carried out from the end of the 14th century, to actually look at the following one as in a comprehensive Polish-Lithuanian fashion. Right, and the first step, right, was the Krevo Union, now also known as the Act of Krevo, right, this set of prenuptial promises made, in fact, in the homonymous castle on August 14, 1385, by Jogaila, Grand Duke of Lithuania, for the marriage with Jadwiga, also known as Edwig, of Poland, right? That was essentially the heiress to, not just she was actually the first woman to be crowned as monarch of the Kingdom of Poland, right? But she was the youngest daughter of Louis the Great of Hungary, right? That had also been King of Poland. So in the 14th century, remember that the Angevins dynastically were pretty much everywhere. They had, their own French possessions. In that case, not royalty, even though they were royalty as peers of France, etc. But they had lands in the Holy Roman Empire. They had the Kingdom of Naples. They had the Kingdom of Hungary. They had the Kingdom of Poland too at some point. And there is, so I don't think that there is a satisfactory historiographical answer to. We will talk about Jadwiga's say Jadwiga and Jogaila's marriage in a broader sense, because there were different candidates naturally to Jadwiga's hand, and Jogaila, as we were just saying before, could have simply married someone else and changed really the history of Europe forever, right? Today we will not discuss in depth the reasons why the Lithuanians were eventually choosing for Poland. There was much of, again, dynastic contingency, but there is also more systemic reason. That is that still at this point the Teutonic Order, the Ordensstaat, had basically almost managed to wipe out Lithuania. The Lithuanians, in order to save their own land, had first of all expanded south, right, in the Russian territory, as the Mongolian invasions had thrown the Russian Palatinate in turmoil. And so they actually conquered a much larger amount of their own land that was actually more civilized than Lithuania, right? The old Russian Palatinate, places like Galicia, Volhynia, I made a video about that, were actually particularly advanced areas, even after the, let's say, the decline of Kiev, right, following the in fact the Mongol invasions. But they were in this sense still there, right? We have seen how even the steppe invaders are somehow overlooked in the capacity of civilization in maintaining a control of the situation. After all, the Golden Horde remained at the outskirts of civilization, right? They were semi-nomads de facto, Turco-Mongolian, essentially clans that managed to keep together the state fundamentally. But the steppe there and the forest in Eastern Europe are two very different civilizational areas. And yet, for Lithuania, that up to this point was still substantially pagan, not because it had preserved necessarily the truest pagan beliefs, but because of the same country that surely changed over time. It's simply for the political benefit of the situation in which the Teutonic Knights were launching literal crusades, and actually the Lithuanians were negotiating with the Roman papacy abundantly to, say, find a solution. Of course, the Pope was interested because, say, the evangelization of Lithuania would have brought to much greater control, more income, etc. The problem, though, is that the Teutonic Knights were stronger, even in this massive sort of Lithuanian-Ruthenian thing, and the only country that could essentially tip the balance was Poland, right? It was actually more powerful than Lithuania, that had actually been harassing Poland. I mean, Lithuanians were some of those pagans, such as the Prussians, the Semites, etc., that the Polish kings had enthralled the Teutonic Knights to fight against. The Lithuanians had attacked Poland on a number of occasions in the past, but when both the Poles and the Lithuanians understood, right, that the Teutonic Knights were to break through, right, and cause severe problems to both countries, because Poland was a bit cut off from, for example, the Baltic was fundamentally Germanic in dominance. It had this is also interesting about Poland, that this is the old Poland, right, that you can't quite find the map exactly the way it was before, even for the contemporary country, and so a process, say a polity that had come to be in a way we discussed in other videos about the earlier times. There is a pretty hefty Polish history playlist, and that was also risky to be cut out, right, cut from the Baltic, from the most important trade. So the Polish-Lithuanian alliance at last seemed to be the most sensible thing. Jogaila, at the moment of his marriage with Jadwiga, was the Grand Duke of Lithuania, as well as the last de facto pagan state, say ruler in Europe. This is fascinating. There would be heretics later on this Central European crowns, etc., but actually one only, but notably George of Podebrady, but not a pagan. And time had come from Lithuania for Christianizing and making the choice of Christianizing Roman Catholic, right? Not Orthodox, even though, of course, an important part of this Ruthenian, especially the latter aspect, the latter part, territory was and would remain Orthodox, and Order was eventually the Uniate Church, etc. Made lots of videos about Ukrainian history as far as that is concerned. That explains to you how sort of identitary this issue was, but there was a gradual expansion of Polish-Lithuanian, and especially Polish power, even over the Lithuanians in the Union, because Poland, again, was much stronger than Lithuania, just per se, even if it was less extended, right? Central Europe is more advanced than Eastern Europe, and there you can appreciate, of course, the difference in quality, and not just that. This is the mechanism, more or less, through which this huge state, right, was going to be. And it was not over, because just as you have this marriage, you could have others. And at some point, Jagiellonian Europe will include Bohemia and Hungary and parts of, say, Moldavia. You have the same Teutonic Order that was already a vassal of the Poles, but that comes back after bitter struggle, and it's a huge thing, right? It's a territory that extends deep into today's Russia. It even reached the Adriatic, right? So the Black Sea, the Balkans. So it's massive Europa Jagiellonica. So the Union of Krevo was arranged also for Jogaila's baptism. Of course, he could have not married Jadwiga. That was much more prestigious as the Angevin heiress to the Polish throne, and Queen of Poland herself, right? So if Jogaila had not become a Christian and a Roman Catholic one, right? And Jogaila was baptized as Vladislav, right, in Poland, and he also kept the Polish version of his Lithuanian name, Jagiello, as Zamoyski, right? This is obvious because, say, Polish interference in Lithuania had already been there. Like, they were two close countries, different in language, etc., but still, say, habituated to have this sort of elective idea of, okay, let's call this guy from this other chunk of the, say, from this other country, and let's Polonize him conceptually, right? It was really typical, saying with the same Angevins as we've seen now, etc. There was a threat already at this point from the Muscovy that was, of course, much less important than the Teutonic one for the Poles, the Lithuanians, but there were conjunctions between them, so it was necessary to ally. And this union between Poland and Lithuania was truly unique in the sense that, especially from a cultural point of view, you had a Western or Latin and an Eastern or Byzantine reality practically coming together. Especially the Rusian Palatinate was not much. In fact, Lithuania, as we've seen, had a pagan background, but the actual land, the richest, most prosperous, most cultured lands of the Rus that were entering in the Polish orbit, right, through the Lithuanian Union, the union with the Lithuanians, it would remain until essentially the 18th century. So this, we're talking, as you understand, almost half of a millennium of history, of European history, that has been somehow forgotten. We will come back on this reality. We've seen something from Deluge from a military point of view, and of course the Eastern European part was more of a periphery, right? Poland was a true center, but right, they were bringing something themselves, as they were also getting a lot from Poland, by the way. So the idea of a common state under Vladislav II Jagiellon was actually accepted. The Polish ruling oligarchy was, of course, to extend as much as possible Polish influence into Lithuania, but there was not much that could be done to conquer this land, also because, it would have not really brought that much help, not just because of the game with the Teutonic Knights, etc., but because how do you actually conquer, and why do you conquer those? I mean, Bohemia, Hungary were just closer at hand. They were more interesting realities. Even there, the purpose was to pursue a dynastic collection of crowns, right, and getting a bit from all of this system in order to try to centralize more as a monarchy against this very powerful oligarchy, right, that had instead thought to wage war into Lithuania, etc. So the monarchy was mitigating that, and as unrealistic as it was, right, it could have been much more energy spent and wasted in order to conquer Lithuania. But again, with the Teutonic Knights around, would have not done it. It's rather later that Lithuania loses political importance in the Union. So, of course, there were territorial disputes and warfare between Poland and Lithuania, right? And this was not merely an antagonism between the two countries. It was about the respective aristocracies, factions within them, and mostly revolving around the idea of a centralized monarchy, or I'd say a concentrated monarchy, and what was owed by the nobility, and also of course, the rights of every chunk and how these would be recognized by the ruler. So, of course, in order to preserve a control on Lithuania, the Polish king had to be careful with his doing. The Lithuanians had even at some point thought they could finally conspire with the Teutonic Knights against Poland for how powerful it really was. But given that the Knights were technically after they couldn't quite simply attack Poland as a whole, right? The papacy would have had problems with that, so as long as Lithuania was still, say, pagan, it couldn't quite, and after all that much harsher history of war with the Teutonic Knights, would have not made much sense to continue, say, to pursue an alliance against those who wanted just to eat them alive. And Poland saved Lithuania, by the way, right? If we were talking about the actual, because Lithuania is just the top northern chunk of this immense territory, right? That we call the Grand Duchy as a whole, right? And that's exactly the part that borders with the Teutonic Knights, and basically all the vast resources of Ruthenia in the south were just squeezed by the Lithuanians in order to put up a resistance against the Teutonics in the north. That's the mechanism, more or less. And yet they were losing on the longer run. It was one of the fiercest struggles in the history of Europe. If you consider in relative terms the resources were invested by these societies, not even say that the 100 Years' War between France and England can compare in that relative term. The political influence of the Jagiellonian rulers was also a matter of negotiation itself. Like, they could choose this external monarchy, after all, from the weaker side, right, to content the Polish szlachta, right? So it was a Polish choice fundamentally. There was an increasing need to concentrate power, however, especially against the state of the Teutonic Order, to levy resources in a much more effective way. The landed nobility already by this point had basically established itself as the true the true political backbone, right, of these countries. You know that on the longer run, this elective monarchies will fail to become dynastic de facto. So the entire countries would fail, but it would take, again, half of a millennium. So that's also something you want to appreciate in these earlier times for how it was actually working after all and becoming one of the greatest powers in Europe. And indeed, the Jagiellonian era is considered legitimately as a moment of great political power, of great prosperity, a true golden age, especially of Polish culture, and it cannot be denied, really. Poland was westernizing significantly at the end of the Middle Ages. Was really not much of a difference anymore with any sort of ethnic sense as far as political and military culture was concerned. It would be later on, especially in the early modern age, where also the union with Lithuania was reinforced further, that Poland sort of re-easternized to cope better with this immense eastern frontier that they had with the Tartars, with the Ottomans at that point. And so we get quite picturesque things like the so-called winged hussars, etc. But if you had, say, appreciate, as we can do, by the way, through, say, the iconographic sources, archaeology, and more, of course, and I made a video about this, especially as far as the army organization of the Polish-Lithuanian Union at this point is concerned. It was in the Polish component, or in the Polish part of the Union, of course, a fully westernized reality. Gothic, full-plate Gothic armor for, say, the ultra-elite. Then you had, say, the spread of firearms. You have still even capable infantry by some degree, even though German influence was also increasing over time in arms and armor in the area. The Lithuanians were more backwards, right? They had their own boyars, closer, say, culturally and sort of lifestyle, in appearance to the Ruthenian ones, right? And there is a lot of even Mongol influence to some degree in these arms and armor, etc. So they are different worlds, indeed, and Poland is a bit like the civilizer here. This struggle with the Teutonic Knights was, as we've seen, one of the first reasons of the Polish-Lithuanian alliance. And you have the famous Great War of 1409-1411, culminated with the Battle of Grunwald, also known as Żalgiris or Tannenberg, one of the most famous battles of the Middle Ages, in which a Polish-Lithuanian army essentially crushed the Teutonic Knights in open field and brought essentially to the decline of the order, right, sanctioning the rise in supremacy of Poland, right. Things were not over yet, but once you inflicted such blows, right, that was a massive engagement, really, that was highering dramatically the stakes in the war situation. We're talking about at least tens of thousands of men from both sides, right? And we are at the beginning of the 15th century. It is true that Poland especially had been spared a little bit by from the plague, right? And had been increasing its importance in the area. But again, the balance was also very much leveled, right? The odds to defeat the order were not that high in the first place. This war was precipitated by Lithuanian uprising in the order controlled Samogitia, one of the historical regions of the Baltic, and one of the 5 cultural areas of Lithuania. From Tannenberg in Masuria, the Poles and Lithuanian, Ruthenian forces proceeded to further to attack the Teutonic stronghold of Malbork, that is Marienburg, but the siege of the fortress was really ineffective, except for the fact that it brought with itself an important shattering of all the territory that, of course, the knights could had been able to control up to that point when their main army had been taken out, right, and their defeat would essentially prevent from recovering further. So this would have significant consequences later on, because, as you know, the Teutonic Order sort of legacy was collected by the Prussians, and this would be one of the say dismembers of Poland later on. So much changed that it's difficult to even recollect, but just imagine the success of the siege of Malbork, right? It would have been incredible, to say the least. Poland would have surely become a much greater power at that point. But a Peace of Thorn in 1411 was signed, right? Poland and Lithuania had essentially been content with just modest territorial adjustments, including some addition, because they were exhausted from the fort. They had also achieved, they had really beaten the enemy in open field. This meant a lot, as we've seen, concerning the strategic projection capability of the Teutonic Order. After the Peace of Thorn, there were further negotiation and say deals that, however, didn't work out really. So war really continued to some degree, and it dragged long enough to be to remain an unresolved issue in the relative arbitration that took place at the famous Council of Constance, that in present-day Germany, that was just the other day we were talking about Swabia, but that this circumstance saw an enormous deal of political, military, religious issues discussed, right, as we will see now. One concerning the Hussite wars that had been tearing apart Bohemia between 420 and 434. Why is this important? Well, because the heresy known as Hussitism risked to spill over into Poland, right? That could have created problems to the monarchy, could have been ridden by some rebel. The Jagiello, Vytautas, and Sigismund Korybut were involved, right, in some attempts, say, to take control of the same Czech crown that the heretic Hussites had offered first to the Jagiello, and then, this Vytautas was a ruler of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. Sigismund Korybut was a duke from the homonymous dynasty. I mean, these were players because, say, even with the union, there wasn't really an automatic succession that every ruler, again, of Poland was also ruler of Lithuania. It was always two separated things going on, right, at this point. So you could have, say, somebody in Lithuania not recognizing the current king, even though he was a Lithuanian, like in this case, and having internal clashes, and, say, the king sending maybe his own son to the country and managed to be elected there. So really messed up situations. But of course, the Czech crown, in spite of the mess that the Hussite wars had turned it into, was quite of a prey where it could be squeezed significantly. Zbigniew Olesznicki, the Bishop of Krakow, right, one of the most high-ranking Roman Catholic clergymen, right, and Polish statesman and diplomat of the time, became known as the leader of the increasing opposition to the spread, in fact, of Hussitism from Bohemia into Poland. Right, this guy stood also because Krakow is also just not just the capital de facto of the country and it had that sort of political role, but it's also close to Bohemia. So the various machinations between the countries could be handled much more closely from there. The Jagiellonian dynasty, as we just recalled, was not entitled to automatic hereditary succession. So every king had to be elected by the nobility, and Vladislav had two sons, right, late in life, by the way, from his last wife, that was Sophia of Halszany. In 1430, the Polish nobility agreed to the succession of the future Vladislas III, only, however, after the king gave in and financially guaranteed the satisfaction of the nobiliar demands that included essentially the reinforcement of their position within their own oligarchic states, sort of petty kingdoms within the same Poland that is basically like the plague of the Polish kingdom throughout history. Like, it's something that was, in spite of moment of, say, reunification under a single dynasty at some point, were very rare, by the way. They had prevented, in fact, the state to reinforce itself in a more unitary direction. But it was also the only way to claim at least a rule over the country as a whole. Then, from there, with the money you would get, the support you would get, you would still be able to challenge part of the nobility, to split them, to try to centralize from the royal household, etc. In 1434, Vladislav Jagiello died. He was very old, and his minor son, Vladislav, was crowned. In 1438, those Czechs that were fighting against the Habsburgic interference in Bohemia, and mostly Hussites, right, offered their national crown to Jagiello's younger son, Casimir IV. Right, this is fascinating. We just said about this ages, right? Casimir was born when his father was 65, right? If you look at how long he would live, right, until 1492, and you consider that his father was born 140 years earlier, right? You really get a sense of, oh my God, that Jagiello was born just after Black Death in the mid-14th century. This guy has arrived basically to see the discovery, to be contemporary to the discovery of America. So just think about all the knowledge, all the, of course, the relation between this, even father and sons, etc., was different from a conventional one, in at least we can think today, even though today it's almost inexistent in practice. But definitely there were so many views, so many values, so many different ideas, and a world was changing. Yes, in Central and Eastern Europe, the world was changing in a slightly slower way than elsewhere, but Just think about all these events, right? And especially the Hussite request, right, to have Casimir as king of Bohemia, albeit definitely objected by the Bishop of Krakow, Olesznicki, met actually with the consent of the Polish nobility, and it resulted also into Polish military expeditions in Bohemia that, however, both failed. All right, and Bohemia was a terrible ground. First of all, the country was being literally destroyed by the Hussites. Like, Bohemia went back to the Stone Age, lost 1/3 of its inhabitants, all in that mess that the Hussite wars really were. Nobody won, right? The country was devastated, to say the least. The Poles, however, had their own old issue with the control of parts of Silesia. I made a video about the duchy specifically, and those were exactly some of the most decentralized, fragmented areas right within, say, the Polish and Bohemian crowns. They were content, in fact, with both. So it was a frontier where almost everything was inconclusive for anyone. Also, the Hungarians invaded at some point, but you couldn't quite easily centralize from Bohemia, right? Say the main establishment remained around Prague, and say it was not that simple to simply conquer the area as a whole. Again, we are in the early 15th century. Europe is in part exhausted by the crisis of the previous generations. There are cyclical epidemics. There is a lot of bad stuff going on in general, and the states are just trying desperately to essentially remain on their feet from one side, or at least becoming effective states, right? Managing to institutionalize this process of resources acquisition that was the only one to which a state could exist, and not just a failed one where everybody could like Bohemia to some extent, that would later be hegemonized by someone else, by the way. Of course, the Poles there were also trying to check, in fact, the other neighbors' ambitions over Bohemia, and we've seen how complex in some recent videos that country was actually to rule as a whole, right? There were parts of it that were German, parts of them that were actually depending even in part on Poland. It would remain also during the early modern age politically. So it's not that easy. When Vytautas, the Grand Duke of Lithuania, died in 1430, his country became embroiled in a series of internecine wars, as well as conflict with Poland, that obviously would try to exploit this instability to affirm itself further. Even the king, in fact, Vladislav III, sent his own son Casimir on a mission there in 440. It was nothing, say, extra, like it didn't have a very strong retinue or whatever, but unexpectedly he was proclaimed Grand Duke of Lithuania by the local nobility, who kept him there amicably, so as a ruler, also because it's something you can't quite simply refuse, meaning that if you had achieved that, of course you had to take roots there. You had, at least, of course, he would go back also as king of Poland, etc. But it was important for the time to exploit that situation. Furthermore, another big chunk of Europe was associated with Poland, as Olesznicki from Krakow managed to create a Polish union with the Hungarian crown as well. Things were not that easy further south. In fact, the Ottoman Turks were threatening the same Hungary that was sort of shattered by the events, was mostly by this oligarchy that was searching for external foreign kings that wouldn't interfere with their own affairs. It's definitely a critical situation. But at the same time, they stabilized the Polish-Lithuanian Union because they were requesting through such dynastic union Polish-Lithuanian support, right, to stop the Ottomans, right. In 1440, Vladislav III responded by assuming the Hungarian throne, and influenced by the Roman cardinal Julian Cesarini, Vladislav led the Hungarians against the Turks twice, in 1443 and in 1444. In the latter year, Vladislav, as much as the cardinal, were killed at the famous Battle of Varna in eastern Bulgaria against the Ottoman army of Sultan Murad II. This, together with Nicopolis, was one of the greatest disasters, right, in the Crusades, and specifically the Balkan ones, right, the attempt to stop the Turks, right, was not actually over, right. There were important chances even after Belgrade 1456, etc. So nothing was unstoppable, really, but this was a disaster, and the King of Poland died himself in battle, right. And you have say, among the Poles, etc., this sort of you can see it in their art, etc., this sort of more Eastern flavored sense of martyrdom and of, say, the obscurity of the world, and these times definitely embodied well, because Constantinople is being surrounded. There is this general awareness of the threat, right? Plus, the situation had been internally difficult, because in the say last years of Jogaila's life, that, as we've seen, had been very long and characterized by these struggles. Poland was hegemonized, right, and ruled by the magnate oligarchy, at the head of which was the powerful Bishop of Krakow, Polish-Lithuanian. There was, of course, an attempt to keep the various Szlachta clans down. These were also solving matters on their own. For example, Olesnicki was able to defeat at the Battle of Grodniki in 1439 the Polish nobleman Spitek of Mersztyn, who had basically been supporting the Hussites. And after this engagement, the heretical presence in Poland was suppressed, so that even though, of course, the Hussites were defeated in a broader sense, and they emigrated to other countries, including, in fact, the same Poland, mostly Germany, they were not much of a political threat anymore, right? They spread germs of rebellion, even in a sort of proto-Protestant fashion, but Poland was more homogeneous. The oligarchs ruled. There was not much of a chance at that point to start a sort of an heretical uprising for, say, maintaining the same prerogatives that, after all, these oligarchs really wanted, to keep things really as it had always been, right, and cultivating further autonomy and using that eventually to, so of course, compete for power, but being checked in part by the other oligarchs, so it was almost the same circle going around. In 1445, Casimir Jagiellon, that as we have seen was the brother of Vladislav III and the son of Jogaila, and at that point Grand Duke of Lithuania, as we observed, was asked from the same Polish oligarchy to assume their throne, right, given that there hadn't been a monarch after Vladislav's death in the Battle of Varna in the previous year, right? And Casimir was shrewd in this because he wasn't simply accepting. He had at least a lot he could negotiate from, especially the Lithuanian faction. So he wouldn't accept the Polish nobility's requests for his election that naturally entailed that further autonomization we were just talking about. Right. Casimir was the third and youngest son of Vladislav / Jogaila, and his fourth wife, that was Sophia of Alshani. We have observed the generational difference between Casimir and his father, as much as was the same for his brother Vladislav III, and there was some expectation, of course, of Casimir to just becoming an adult, right, and assuming control of the kingdom accordingly. But in spite of this, Casimir had not been prepared exactly for this. Normally, say there would be a basic curriculum for in the expectation of becoming such a powerful monarch in Europe at the time. For example, Casimir was never taught Latin, right? He had not been prepared to assume taking on responsibilities in government, etc. Even though he was, of course, in the line of succession that, as we've seen, didn't quite exist dynastically, but that was based on this sort of prestige that, of course, the children of the previous sovereign really had. He wasn't even a consumed politician either, right? Nor he maintained specifically. He had a sort of intuition on his own. He had a great diplomatic interest, though, as he was aware, at least, of the mechanism that he had observed as in Lithuania with this request, demands from the Polish nobility and the international role that his family had played up to that point. He was also interested in, say, the economy, right, of his possession, which is also important. Bishop Zbigniew had been his mentor and tutor. However, he fundamentally disliked him. He thought that he would have not been a successful monarch after his father's death. This, of course, was just a gamble. They were not so different, the two. They were, after all, somehow energetic and to the point people, right? They tended to make things work dynamically. In any case, that's how Casimir arrived to power, right? There was also the sudden death of Sigismund Kęstutis, that was also Grand Duke of Lithuania from 432 to 440, right? He had basically baptized, but he had also still a pagan Lithuanian birth name, just to tell you how, let's say, close that still the old world really was. He was also very old, by the way. He was born in 1365, so these were the old guard. They were trying sort of to still not oppose the process of Christianization. Like in this case, you have, of course, a Christian identity, so politically, but at least, trying to use still that old rhetoric to reinforce the sense of local prerogatives that eventually the Polish monarchs would have had to keep respect, right? The voivode of Trakai, that is also, one of the most famous castles, right, in medieval Europe, right, just surrounded by on an inlet, basically, and really in the environment reflecting what the Lithuanian territory had been. Made multiple videos about Lithuanian warfare, especially tactics during the Baltic Crusades, and it was a difficult, tough, hostile territory still, also for the Poles that had gotten the upper hand anyway. The voivode of Trakai was Jonas Gustavus, and he, with other Lithuanian oligarchs, supported Casimir as a candidate to the ducal throne of Lithuania. This is how he had really started back in the day. Many Polish noblemen had underestimated the support. They thought this guy at the time, Casimir, was 13, right? He could be a sort of, say, vice regent for the Polish king in Lithuania. Instead, as he arrived in Vilnius in 1440, he was elected Grand Duke of Lithuania on June the 29th by the Council of Lords, right? So the main permanent institution of central government in the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, active as we've seen in Vilnius, but say otherwise not. So the only, so in a very decentralized country in many ways. And still, this was done again by considering him as a pawn, right, to pressure the Poles as well from the Lithuanian background. Say, if you give him so much power, right, he is gonna, of course, work for you, all right, because otherwise he could not done much in the first place. As we've seen, Casimir followed on the Polish throne after his brother was killed at the Battle of Varna. There actually was sort of interregnum lasting until his crowning on June the 25th, 1447, right? But at the end of the day, the situation stabilized, right? He also made this interesting marriage with Elizabeth of Austria, that was the daughter of the late King of the Romans Albert II of Habsburg, from his late wife Elizabeth of Luxembourg, of Bohemia, right? And her distant relative was Frederick the Fair, Frederick the Handsome, from the House of Habsburg, who became Holy Roman Emperor later on as Frederick III, until after Casimir's own demise. This marriage was important because it sort of extended Polish influence over the Hungarian Bohemian area. Also, Casimir entered sort of more conflictual relation with the Holy Roman Emperor, yes, but still fueling an internal Habsburgic feud between these various branches that, as you know, had reconsolidated, but after substantial infighting after the split in the second half of the 14th century. And, of course, a divided Habsburgic house that was at this point also having problems with Hungary. There were lots of wars going on, could, of course, advantage the Jagiellonians. Casimir, as King of Poland, acquired a much greater power than he had while he was just Grand Duke of Lithuania, right? And as a consequence, he also dismissed the privileges that the Lithuanian oligarchy had managed to have him, say, recognized to some degree, as long as he was ruling in that country. For example, the Vilnius privilege of 1447 had declared the Lithuanian nobility to have equal rights with the Polish Szlachta, which was a bit difficult and a very actually pushed international juridical position, because it was sort of forcing, right? Not much just the fact that, you know, there had to be sort of equality, right, within the union of Poland and Lithuania, just per se. While of course Poland was much stronger, as the rejection of the same concession actually proves. But because by establishing this, Casimir had sort of proved to be wanting to concentrate power further, to be able to say from two different countries that had just wanted to unite, but as still separated ones, right? At best with a common ruler, but in the various countries of the respective office, not part of something greater, right? That he would bypass that and could even decide simply that, okay, these two peoples now have equal, let's say these two national nobilities have sort of equal rights with one another. What would have been the point of that, right? It was just by itself too much of a demand, especially for the Poles, because you could even declare that in Lithuania, but then what, right? When Casimir went ruling in Poland, things changed. There was also, at this point, the removal of Cardinal Olesznicki by Casimir, who had managed to receive enough support from the sort of middle Szlachta, right? This was a very important political success because, as we've seen, the Cardinal Olesznicki embodied a bit like the top, right, oligarchy of Poland, right? Ecclesiastical one in this case, but backed by also great competitors to the crown. And this was a bit like the revenge of, instead, those smaller aristocrats that were still making essentially the bulk of the backbone of the the Polish army, and that were sort of worried of course, an oligarchic superpower, and had thus much in common with the monarchy, right? Consider that these were times of war indeed, as the so-called 13 years ones from 1454 to 1466 really prove. Consider that in order to get rid of Olesznicki, Casimir had to win a conflict with the same papacy, and of course the local Polish church hierarchy regarding the right to appoint episcopal positions. This is quite interesting because if you look at the history of Central Europe, and especially the investiture controversy, you know that the papacy and the Germans had been really battling over this, and Poland was sort of a world on its own, right? And there is an anecdote which the Polish kings, even though fully Catholic and so recognizing the papal the papal authority, were bragging against in front of the Holy Roman Emperors, that while the latter had to obey to the Pope, the kings of Poland didn't, right? But this was, say, considering the universal hierarchy of power, the empire was to command in Poland, which technically wouldn't happen now. So this is part of the beauty of the Middle Ages and its own contradictions, but connected with the local sort of identities and way these countries had come to be, right? And it would be beautiful just to digress and explaining why that was the case, how paradoxically exactly this sort of machinus system within Poland and the general closeness of other, let's say, interesting lands, say in the south of Europe and so on, had prevented the Germans from taking over Poland, right? Just as Hungary, after all. But there had been a very strong influence. The same Teutonic Knights did remain an enemy, right? A competitor within the same Poland. So there had never been. They had started as vassals of the Polish king, notoriously, but they had not been dislodged yet. And it's exactly in the year in which Casimir won his controversy with the church that the Prussian Confederation, that was made up of 53 noblemen and clergymen in 19 cities in Prussia, asked him for help against the Teutonic Order. Essentially, the Prussian Confederacy had been born exactly out of these communities within the orbit of Teutonic power, as a consequence also of the collapse of the latter's power after Tannenberg. And given that, again, this was technically Polish land, right? They turned to this power to say, okay, we do not want to be under the Teutonic Knights that still control us, so we give you green light to attack them, which brought to this terrible war. First of all, Casimir responded to the Prussian Confederation by making it a protectorate of the Polish kingdom, so even treating them with some sort of greater autonomy than he could have simply claimed Polish territory. The insurgent cities rebelled at that point with Polish support against the Teutonic Order, which was not, however, to simply fall, right? They had hope they could essentially achieve that, right? They could besiege Malbork again. Nevertheless, it is at this point that the Poles managed to take over Marienburg, right, the Teutonic capital, Malbork Castle, together also, of course, with the support of the Prussian Confederation. This led to the second peace of Thorn that again occurred after this extensive period of military effort, which had a toll in itself. Yet the consequence was important, as the Teutonic Order first of all recognized Polish sovereignty over those regions in the west of Prussia would be known as Royal Prussia, that had in fact seceded, right? The Polish crown's overlordship was also recognized over the remaining Teutonic state that would be transformed in 1525 into a duchy, that is Ducal Prussia. I made a video about this specifically. In the process of this war, Poland also gained Pomerania, also known as Eastern Pomerania, Vistula, Pomerania, that was a great object of content throughout the entire Polish-Teutonic relations, as it was basically the gateway to the Baltic, right, and all the important cities that, of course, controlled the Vistula river, and so up to that point had been simply controlled by the order, and preventing Poland from getting all the revenues that could get from there. Also Warmia, this region that eventually was centered around Fromborg, right, and Blitzbach, Verminsky. The largest city is Olsztyn, right, on the Uina River. It's not enormous, right, but it had its strategic relevance. There was really a very extended theater of operation, after all. Naval battles, not just land operations, had taken place. This shows how the Poles were able to exploit the potential of those coastal cities that were fundamentally German, such as Danzig, right? That, however, had gained significant autonomy, and when the order sort of collapsed, were able to support Poland to get rid of the most immediate, say, ruler, but still gaining enormous autonomy in itself. We explained also how militarily powerful Danzig was in that video about the Polish-Lithuanian army organization. It was still essentially German islands within the country. But for Poland, they successfully fought the Danish and Teutonic fleets that were not just nothing, right? And this tells you, however, how powerful the cities really were, right? So this phase was particularly important in Polish history because, as you understand, it opened the path to that further consolidation that was much needed, especially for the monarchy to survive within the same system, right? That wouldn't change really, but the income, the prerogatives, the capacity of centralizing these de facto conquered areas was particularly relevant. It was carried out under Casimir, right? Poland expanded further, coming to include the Duchy of Oswiecim, I think it's pronounced. That was one of the many chunks of Silesia, right? That had fragmented, as we were recalling before, but this would create interesting consequences, as we were saying, because these lands would become Habsburgic in the following century, and still there was a part of the country that fell under somebody else's rule. You have the Duchy of Zator, right, that is also a Silesian one, on the border with Lesser Poland, and this made also things more interesting. It sort of consolidated further this southern frontier, right? Eventually, as you know, the center of Polish power tended to move from Krakow to in Lesser Poland to Mazovia, later on with Warsaw, but that's really another story. Because troubles were coming from the south, was the collapse of Hungary during the Ottoman onslaught. That was a big deal. There was also, at this point, a progress in that direction, especially the integration of the incorporation of the Mazovian voivodeship, or Piast, known also as Piast Mazovia, right, as one duchy into the crown proper, right? Because there had been some seigniorates in Poland, and so the crown had mostly been governing from them, and gradually they were absorbing this land within the crown very slowly, right, but steadily, and especially under Casimir. Now, the interesting aspect about the Polish-Lithuanian Union at this point is also that ipso facto, and given that Poland had the upper hand in the system, this brought the Poles to cope also with the Eastern world, right? Especially the one being threatened by the Ottomans and the Tatars. There is no doubt that in Casimir's time, and that's why I made that video about Europa Jagiellonica, the Polish-Lithuanian Union was highly regarded where it was a huge, big, powerful reality that had managed again to fundamentally emancipate itself, follow a unitary direction, at least as far as the interests of the various nobility to stick together was concerned. We see this collection of crowns. Casimir's son Vladislav became, for example, King of Bohemia in 1471, and in 1490 also of Hungary, while his father was reigning. So technically, that's how these additions, this power even much greater. Naturally, this doesn't mean that the Poles ruled over Bohemia or Hungary, where it was, again, the local nobility, very often split, and so not really unanimous, nor capable or willing to provide, again, a control over the entire country, would elect this external foes, and they were hoping to be co-opted in a sense. I mean, not within the Polish-Lithuanian system. Bohemia and Hungary really were not even considering Lithuania to some degree. It was Poland, however, that emanated at this point all this power, etc., so they could be part of that establishment. It could be a sort of stabilizing capacity, even though the Ottomans were really taking advantage, especially of Hungary, and Hungarian sort of weakness at this point. There were attempts, of course, to keep things together, but the oligarchic power is so strong that the monarchy had gone rapidly deteriorated. The southern and eastern outskirts of the Union became threatened at this point by the Ottomans. Right? We've seen in that video about Moldavian history how Poland had been involved in this country's affairs since 1387. At the time, Petru I, Hospodar of Moldavia, had sought protection from Poland against the Hungarians. This was somehow typical because Hungary again had this ambition also across the Carpathians further in the east, but especially since Poland and Lithuania had been unifying, it was much easier, right, from the northwest to control, to provide support to Moldavia, not just against the Hungarians, but also against the Ottomans. Petru I paid, by the way, at that time, Jogaila homage in Lviv, Galicia, which was part of the Rusian Palatinate, telling the truth, and we've seen there what the intersections were, so with Moldavia, that in practice provided the Poles with access to the Black Sea ports that were being threatened there by the Ottomans, that were essentially taking out the Genoese colonies and sort of, threatening, in fact, the same coastland, say the same interland right from the coast, and causing significant damage, mostly thanks to support of the Tatars that we will see now, because those were raiders. The Grand Duchy was very much opened, right, to raids. There was the Golden Horde. There had been at least, and the capacity to still launch offensives from there historically had been occurring. Poland had suffered in the 13th, 14th century 3 Mongol invasions, right? So there was this sense that whatever was coming from that area, if destabilized, would be trouble. So much so that Casimir himself, in 1485, undertook an expedition into Moldavia after the Ottoman Turks had overtaken its seaports, right? A major deal. At that point, the Crimean Tatars were instructed by the Ottomans to raid the eastern territories, We are after, of course, the fall of Constantinople, talking 1482, 1487. At this point, Casimir's son and eventual successor, John Albert Jan Olbracht, right, confronted them. Poland was attacked in 1487, 49, with what was essentially the relics of the Golden Horde we just mentioned. And the raids went as far as Lublin, that is not, let's say, the very center of Poland, but still it's proper, Polish land that, was invaded, right? The Tartars were defeated at Zaslavl, by the way, so of course there wasn't at that point a major capacity to wage campaigns against the key cities of Poland by the Ottomans. But let's say, remember that still in 1683, at the siege of Vienna, well, during the preparations, there was still, say, during the planning, there was some option still for Warsaw and not Vienna to be besieged. Of course, it would have been more complicated, but let's say there were also, less obstacles in between paradoxically, even if it was more distant, right? It would have been relatively less resistance. It would have been complicated, say, to handle, but at that point by the same Ottomans, so that's why Vienna was objectively more relevant. But the idea that you can project into Central Europe, right, is something that the Ottomans had started to toy from the Balkans, from the same Eastern European proxies. All right. John Albert made an attempt to eradicate this military threat in 1497, but he was defeated, right? He wasn't able to bring into the struggle his brothers, as we've seen before, Vladislas, that is Ladislaus II of Bohemia, in Hungary, and even Alexander, who was the Grand Duke of Lithuania, right? And since the ruler of Moldavia, Stephen the Great, that we have seen also recently in the video about Vlad Tzepes, was recalcitrant, right? There was a risk of, in fact, even Moldavia to be, say, at some point they sided with the Turks themselves because they thought that, say, their presence was sort of less frequent, less intense, that the Poles could get, right, if they could get their hands over Moldavia. So we have seen it in the video about Moldavia clearly, right? But also this country was losing sort of independence in the process, so de facto outlining their what would have been historically a Polish Ottoman frontier, in spite of Transylvania and other realities that existed at the time. The Ottomans, by the way, were keeping to instigate destructive Tartar offensives, which occurred in 1498, 99, 1500. You understand how regular they were, and so how hammering and devastating. So that the Poles of Jan Olbracht brought to the peace of 1503, right? These were posthumous to the same John, but they hadn't really brought to much else than a truce, right? Even just the territorial issues with the Ottomans in this very floating frontier, where you couldn't quite centralize that much. You had these local communities that were just trying to survive in where another could switch allegiance that easily, would maintain the situation extremely precarious, right? But while also the Ottoman power was increasing, but also the Polish-Lithuanian one was historically. So you have this picture. It's a dramatic one, but towards the end. But overall, the success, especially during the 13 years war, the initial ones in the century, at Tannenberg, etc., had definitely founded, had laid the premises, let's say, for a very big power to consolidate in Central Eastern Europe, that would have really, in fact, been one to reckon with in the following couple of centuries. Right, and if you look at my Polish history playlist, you can find everything you like. We will keep updating, of course, on it. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.